This is the Dane Moore NBA podcast coming to you Friday morning. It's September 27th, and we got Britt Robson back here to talk about the second half of his Q&A with Chris Finch. If you missed the episode on Monday, Britt does this annual big 60, 70-minute talk with Finch that he turns into like a written Q&A. You should definitely go check that out if you haven't already. We're going to be referencing it extensively here in this episode. But on Monday, Britt and I talked about the first half of that Q&A, parts 1 and 2, and didn't really have enough time in the hour that we were talking to get into the stuff that was covered in parts 3 and 4. I also think we're kind of, at least for me, feel like okay, my mind is firing on Wolves topics again. So figured we'd have more to talk about with Britt in parts 3 and 4. And I'll probably timestamp these topics, or I will timestamp these topics in the show notes. But what comes up in parts 3 and 4 is Cat building on his success in the playoffs. What does Ant leveling up this year look like? Talks about, or Britt and Finch talked about, the Anderson to Joe Ingles transition. Just the idea of shaping this rotation while it's kind of tricky with two bigs. Accommodating expected improvements from Ant and Jaden. And then the Finch section, I don't want to say the Finch section on his injury was fun, but it was interesting to get an update on Finch's injury. So we'll get into all that stuff with Britt. But Britt, I thought we'd start here by pumping your MinnFest this week. And you want to let people know what you'll be doing?
Yeah. Well, every year MinnPost does this annual fundraiser community thing where a lot of topics get talked about. Whether it's Keith Ellison, a forum on climate change, just a lot of different things. And I did just a meet and greet kind of confab with people last year at it. And this year they wanted me to have a one-on-one interview with somebody. We originally were going to do A-Rod and Lori, but for obvious reasons that didn't come through. And then the second thing was going to be Glenn Taylor, and I think he quite understandably didn't want to sit in front of everybody in the middle of a huge lawsuit about whether or not he's really the owner or not. So we're going to do a 45-minute one-on-one with Wolves CEO Ethan Casson, and basically, among many other things, to explain what a Wolves CEO is. I mean, sure. Because you've got, the ownership. You've got Tim Connolly as the POBO. You kind of know what he does. You know what Chris Finch does. I think he's one of those guys that is in there administratively, caulking some seams, putting out fires, whatever. So anyway, we'll talk to him. And if there's time, take some questions from the audience from him. It's from 2:15 to 3 p.m. tomorrow afternoon at the Westminster Church, which is right down there on, it's 100 yards from CCO's building on Nicollet Mall, 2 blocks away from the Dakota, 3 blocks, whatever, right there in that end downtown of things. Area. Yeah, right where Nicollet Mall kind of finishes up before it heads into South Minneapolis. So, and then after the 45 minutes with Ethan Casson, I'm going to kind of repeat what we did last year in that we'll probably meet in a different room, and it won't be in this kind of forum setting that they have set up. But we'll meet in a room somewhere, and anybody who wants to can just kick it around and ask me whatever they want about the Wolves, and we can talk about things. They can ask about process. Sometimes there's some process questions about how I work or what I think when I do something. So it's totally open. I'm open to answering whatever you got for me, and look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, Saturday afternoon, tomorrow afternoon. I think all of those details that Britt mentioned there, I'm sure you can find at MinnPost.com. In addition to, if you're there reading this Q&A that he did with Finch, I think, you'll get all your information there. And we love it. It's flattering every time we do any sort of these in-person sort of meetup deals, whether they be live shows or the
exactly.
Other way.
It's also just good to meet people and be reminded that there's a dumb question every now and then, but I would say the overwhelming majority of feedback we get from Wolves fan base
Yeah.
it always makes me feel better about the kind of
Mhm.
people I'm writing for and talking to.
Right.
You know, it's generally a pretty smart basketball crowd. So
I agree fully. Yeah. I mean, some of the emails and just messages and stuff that I get, I'm like, oh, okay. I think we were talking about that the other night when we were at the Wolves media event, like people who make you think differently. And when it's a topic that you and I do spend so much time thinking about this Wolves team, when you do
right.
get an idea or a thought from somebody else, that's like, huh, that's a new thought.
Right.
Didn't put that. That's always fun. Okay, so that's on Saturday with
Tomorrow, yeah.
yeah. It doesn't even feel like Friday right now, and my so I'm putting it all together. Okay, so let's jump into the rest of this conversation. On Monday, the topics just didn't have us talking about a big one, which is Cat
Yeah.
and the conversation that you and Finch had about Cat kind of building on the success he had in the playoffs. Finch talked at length with you about how important it was for Cat to be able to hold his own against Kevin Durant in that first round series, be that defensive matchup, and not that KD didn't do his thing sometimes, but guarded KD in a playoff series, and his team swept KD's team. Finch talked about Cat feeling pretty good about that, and then obviously the role he played in guarding Jokic. What stood out to you in your conversation with Finch specific to any sort of Cat bullet point?
Well, he repeated the mantra that, Cat has sacrificed more than anybody. But I think that, and this is something I said that he agreed with, but the most important thing to me was there weren't a lot of yips. There weren't a lot of times when it felt like Cat was in the middle of dreading himself as he was playing. And we've seen that happen, I'd say, a handful of times in big moments. It doesn't have to be the playoffs. It could be the play-in game. It could be, a crucial regular season game where every now and then the moment would overwhelm him. And I think having something, nobody regards Cat as even an average defender for the most part. And I think he's beginning to somewhat push back on that, if not by his, just by the role he plays sometimes. And the fact that he was the logical person, not necessarily the ideal person, but in terms of defense is a team game. And if Cat could be on Durant and if Cat could be on Jokic, the other four matchups made the most sense. Rudy being able to float. So Cat's defensive presence, there's no other way around it, was very, very crucial to winning 2 playoff series. And I think as a result of that, it was easier for Cat to relax into the game and be himself. And that is finally getting back to your question. What Finch was saying is he was kind of much more settled into who he was. And he wasn't, he didn't have any flashy 45-point games. It was the opposite of that. He was a cog, and he was comfortable being a cog. And I think that's big growth. Because you're going to get shooting from Cat. You're going to get, other things when you need it. You're going to get that 40% from deep career big man game. But getting
what you don't know is how much of the yipsy stuff or the
at crucial times and all that other stuff. And when I said no yips, and he acknowledged, he said, the Dallas series, he didn't shoot well. Right. And he chalked it up, and I don't think this is unreasonable. He chalked it up to the fact that players get cold shooting every now and then. And that just happened to be Cat's time when he got cold. So, I don't think I'm excusing Cat. I've ripped him as much as anybody. I do think that the genesis of the question I asked Finch is, do you think his playoff performance in general will enable him to have some momentum and a boost coming into the season? And Finch, he didn't wholeheartedly endorse it, but he said, yeah, I think he will. And I do think he will. I think it was nothing but positive. A lot of positive things happened out of that run to the Western Conference Finals. But one of the most positive things was, as Finch said, kind of the stink of playoff failure got off Cat,
Yeah, he said, and I know he took quote, I know he took pleasure in that. He was pleased with himself for that, end quote. The average defender thing is interesting. It's probably like a good thing to discuss and remind ourselves of. Like, Cat probably should not be discussed as a below average defender anymore. No, I'm not saying he should be the competition for making an all defensive team.
Right.
But what even is the case that he's a below average defender now? I mean, even if you go back to the year before Rudy got here, where they switched defensive coverage, they got Carl out of a drop and they started playing a more effective, aggressive, and thus effective defensive coverage. The Wolves were 13th in defense. Cat had what I was saying at that time. I know we both said this, his best defensive season of his career, right? And then you go to the Rudy year, and Cat gets hurt in year one, so that's like a little bit disjointed. So we're kind of like, okay, how can Cat function, defensively with it next to Rudy? Like, maybe he was an average defender when he was playing center, but now next to Rudy, is he going to be able to be an average defender playing power forward? And what last regular season said was, yes, that is for sure above average defensive play. It was even the defensive numbers, what Finch noted in the piece with you, was that Cat's defensive numbers at center without Rudy were really good last season as well. So Cat was like, all of a sudden, like, okay, the season before Rudy, that was good. Pause for a year while you're hurt. This is working this season pretty well. Still have some concerns about his foot speed, ability to chase out there, the wrong matchup, maybe puncturing him. But still, like, arrow going up. And in the playoffs, he played his best, most impactful, most stink off of him, took pleasure in it, whatever. Like, how if we were at average, has it not trended up even more? I think Cat, particularly after that playoff series, and showing a diversity of ways to be helpful, if not dominant defensively, but helpful. Also thought his rebounding was impressive the whole playoffs. Like, Cat is an above average defender at this point. And I think, 6-7 years ago when you and I were doing a pod, we're like, man, that would be the dream if Karl Anthony Towns could someday turn into becoming an average defensive center. Well, he's kind of done it multi-positionally, but maybe that's even more of a credit to him for his growth that he's made there. And obviously a credit to Rudy, because, the rising tide raises all boats, or however.
Right. And I do think it in a vacuum, Cat may not be an above average defender, but in this context with this team, learning what they have done with him,
right,
I do think, Finch said, when I said, who's best to work with Cat? And he said, well, Rudy, of course, mitigates everybody. But he said on-ball defenders. And that is really true. If Cat doesn't have a lot of people.
Because you don't want Cat going backwards. You don't want Cat going backwards in a retreat.
That's a great, succinct way to say it. Exactly right. Because that is something where it's almost like a guy who's going to maybe try to catch a fly ball when he's on the warning track. And it gets a little bit dicey in terms of, I'm near the basket.
There's the stanchion. Oh, yeah.
So, I do think that, and let's not, I had this said to me by a couple of team members. I don't even remember who it was, but you got to understand that Cat's feet are enormous. And that is, it's not clown shoes, but it's kind of a similar thing in terms of the fact that if your feet are enormous, it's really, really hard to be balletic, moving backwards or side to side. And I think with what Cat has to work with, he's not a super athlete, and he's tall, but he's not quick. And yet he is playing two positions for the number one rated defense in the NBA and was key to winning 2 playoff series. Yes, a lot of that is contextual, but that's the point, isn't it? I mean, if you could put somebody in a position, Dirk Nowitzki wasn't a great defender, but, it isn't like everybody is constantly ripping on Dirk Nowitzki for not being able to play defense. Steve Nash won 2 MVPs being a bad defender.
Right.
Cat is a better defender than Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki. So
yes, he is.
You have these things.
I know what you're saying. Yeah. You can be an offensive leaning player and still your team can still survive defensively for sure. And maybe you do need to make big accommodations. They probably did for Carl, but they did make big accommodations in trading for Rudy Gobert and drafting and developing Jaden McDaniels, who are last year were certainly two of the top 10 defenders in the league. And Jaden does the thing that Finch was talking about there, stopping the ball, providing resistance on the perimeter, something Carl can't do himself. And Rudy gives rim protection and is elite playing a drop, something Carl can't do. So now Carl is being asked to do all the things that he is average at, maybe even slightly above average at, like defensive rebounding wise. He's an A. He's probably a straight A, not even.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So that's been the wise thing about Conley and how they've changed this team is it's been kind of within the design of effectively hiding Carl or accentuating the things that he does better. And that came to a head. I mean, I was somewhat still skeptical about that even, in the middle April before the Phoenix series started, but it did happen. It did happen in the Phoenix series. And then with the help of Rudy in the Denver series, as well. So yeah, I think that just, how can they build on Cat's success? Remind him that he had it, and exactly. I think that's how you stack it from there. There's one interesting, not to spend too much time on Cat, but Finch said he was talking to you about how it's kind of complicated to do rotations when you're trying to move Cat from the 4 to the 5, which I thought was interesting and kind of want to think that one through a little bit. I mean, I get it, but I kind of don't get it. But anyways, what he said was, quote, "I've thought, what if we played the bulk of his minutes at the 4?" About Cat. What did you think? What did you think about him noting that?
I think what he's trying to do is get that big front court that was mentioned in the first part of the interview, that Nas, Cat, Rudy front court, and to put those guys on the court and still give Jaden McDaniels, Mike Conley, and Ant, not to mention Nickeil Alexander and, whatever. And that's kind of what he means when he was saying, if we go to a 10-man rotation, or if we go to a rotation that extends the bench down there because we want to make sure Dillingham doesn't get exposed too much early, then we have to do a few things. But that also means that his other experiments, which is a big front court or whatever, you can't do everything. And one of the things that I thought was really revealing is, it's like he said, yeah, it's one thing to say that your top 8 are gonna have to get 2 or 3 or 4 minutes a game knocked off. It's another thing to figure out how those minutes are apportioned into another rotation. And so what he is saying there, I think, is one of the ways that might work is if you don't play Cat at the 5 as much, and therefore you have Cat getting what would normally be his 5 minutes, being in there with Rudy and Nas rather than that, Okay. And so, and then, you go smaller, you can go smaller with Jaden, you can do Ant, but I do think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I think what they want to do is they want to develop Jaden McDaniels and Nas Reed at the same time that they're vying for championship. And I think that's really smart. I don't think it will hurt the championship push. I think Dillingham is much more of a risk of hurting the championship push. And so I think that trying to figure out rotations that get all this together is going to be crucial for training camp. And let's face it, we've seen this kind of thing before. It may be on opening day, all of this is moot. They go, oh,
Right.
it's just, we have to go back to what works. We've got a ring to win, But I do think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, and there's been plenty of different things like that over the years, even with Finch, where it's like these ideas that come out in training camp that he transparently wants to try, and then you reel back on him. It's like the toggling different defensive coverages when Cat versus Rudy were at the 5. That was a year one failure of the year one of Rudy sort of thing. It was just, it sounded great. I was behind it. I was like, yeah, I don't think Cat should be in a drop, but it turned out to be kind of too complicated, at least in year one, to really kind of be flipping that switch back and forth. So there's all these like ideas, and that's what's cool about Finch, just kind of like openly opining with you about what those are. I did look up just because when he said, what if we played the bulk of his minutes at the 4? I'm like, didn't he play the bulk of his minutes at the 4 last year? And he did. It was 63% of his minutes were at power forward, and then 37 at center. So the center ones were like, of the 37%, it was Cat and Nas. Of him was when Cat was at center, Nas was out there almost the whole time. And then the power forward minutes were the ones where he was next to Rudy. So he did play 63% of his minutes, next to Rudy, which made him power forward, which is kind of a lot already. So I don't know what that would like. I guess I don't know how you can even make it be more power forward minutes. Does that make sense? Like, what?
Yeah, I do. I know what you mean. I think that what we don't know is what is the lineup if you use the 3 bigs in the front court. How do you shift out of that? What's the next rotation? Does Rudy sit down? Does Cat sit down? And if so, where does Nas go?
Right.
Is Nas, and are you going like with
minutes
a
with
Nas,
neither of them?
Exactly. Neither Cat nor Rudy. Right. I mean, I don't know. Or is it, that you're going, you're playing Jaden at the 4 and Joe Ingles at the 3, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. It's just an interesting, like, it's interesting to hear that might be the direction that Finch would lean if he had to choose one direction of like, oh, if I want to give Cat, how do I want to reposition Cat's minutes? Well, he's saying probably at the 4 more rather than the 5. And that's just interesting. I mean, we would, again, 12 months ago, we'd been like, yeah, okay. Like that was, that was the whole concern. So kind of to your point about training camp confusing us. Sometimes we just don't, we don't know it.
Shake Milton was going to be the Rudy whisperer a year ago, literally.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Shake Milton was going to be the guy, perfect compliment for Rudy Gobert. And Tim Connolly and Chris Finch 100% believe that. And I will give them total credit for getting off that as quickly as they could.
That is what's cool about they changed their mind. Like they're willing to change their mind. And I think I think that was a shortcoming of Rosas was like, I chose that I want to go down this path. I put the process into choosing this path and was maybe, too slow to make some of those changes. I think with both.
Not only that, but just trying to jam that round circle into a square peg into a round hole. Like, all right, we're going to shoot threes. We don't have anybody on the team that can shoot threes, but we're going to watch Napier and all these other dudes that are like career 29% shooters chuck up 4 or 5 a game because that's and we'll get in the habit of it. Well, no, the people you're eventually going to have this happen to are not going to be in the habit of it because they're not on the roster yet.
Yeah, that one exactly. That was my point. Thank you for clearing that up. Let's grab our first break here. Want to let y'all know that today's show is brought to you by Falling Knife Brewing Company, but that Britt and I will be at Falling Knife on October 19th. It's again a Saturday afternoon. Falling Knife is hosting Wolves Fest. We'll be there hanging out, drinking beer, and it starts at 3:00, kind of maybe go to like 7 p.m. Where Britt and I are going to do a live pod Q&A type thing. at about 5 p.m. Have I told you yet that they're making a special beer for it, Britt? Have I told you this yet?
No.
It's great. I actually went there last Friday, a week ago.
Are you involved in the making of this?
I mean, like I was there, like I stood there. It is like a collaboration with me, but they're calling it Second Apron is the name of the beer. So they're releasing it at the Wolves Fest party on October 9th.
Well, if they're going to be true to the spirit of you and me, it's got to be some kind of IPA, right?
It's American Pale Ale. So it's not.
That's good.
No,
nothing wrong with that.
I mean, I couldn't try it because it was literally like 140 degrees. Like,
exactly.
Have you been back in that back room there?
I have not been back there when they have been doing it. I go back there to snag some free beer.
It was crazy. It was a crazy operation. But anyways, come out to Falling Knife on October 19th, or also for this Lynx playoff run too. You know, they're showing all the games, and the Lynx won, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was tremendous. I mean, that's a really fun team. And, don't worry about not knowing anything about the WNBA. It's an easy bandwagon to get on because it won't be hard for you to see the differences in the game between the NBA and the WNBA. In many respects, it's a more pass-friendly game. It is. I really like the game. I don't compare it to the NBA because I love the NBA and it's not fair. But I really, really enjoy the WNBA and I love this Lynx team. It's the most greater than the sum of their parts team that the Lynx have ever had.
Sure.
They've got one incredibly talented player and a lot of role players who are feisty and they know their roles and they're mentally tough. And they've got that Connecticut series is going to be a rough series because Connecticut's are, the four teams who should have made it to this point they've all swept their series. Mm-hmm. And so it's a 2-3 matchup. The Lynx are second seed, Connecticut Sun are the third seed. And then it'll be against the 1-4 winner. And the 1-4 winner is like the 4 seed is the defending champion Las Vegas Aces against the team with the best record in WNBA this year. So it is a Liberty. So it's a fun thing to get into, and it basically will be over by the time the Wolves season starts. And by the way, that Falling Knife thing is 3 days before opening day. I mean, there'll be a lot too. We will definitely we'll be teed up to know what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's literally going to be the last pod I do before the season starts. Know, so I think that'll be fun to dive in. But always be thinking about Falling Knife. They support us, make the show happen in many ways. So we'd love you to come out to that and also just patronize the brewery, but particularly for Lynx season. All right, let's keep moving on here. What does leveling up for Ant look like? Was another section of the Q&A with you and Finch, and the two things you highlighted to Finch, and you pitched it in a very nice way. You said like cathedral ceilings for Ant and all these great things, but you go rightfully, the two things, quote unquote, holding him back to some extent is his shot selection and off-ball defense. And I thought you and Finch had a really honest conversation about those two things to some extent, holding Ant back. What stood out to you most there?
I think what stands out to me is just how damn lucky we are to have a head coach have such a good relationship with a superstar that he can casually, honestly get into the weeds on the guy's flaws in a very, very candid way and say, we're trying to, we show him this, we do this. And where he pushed back a little bit on some of the mid-range stuff. And so, but he, at the same time, and he pushed back a little on the off-ball stuff, but there was still enough comments in there. It's just really, really nice to be able to talk to the guy who has a fantastic relationship with that superstar. Those two's, the Finch-Ant pairing is one of the reasons why the future of this team is so bright, because it is not easy to have that kind of relationship happening. And so, I think, and then for our purposes, I always harp on this kind of stuff because this is what differentiates like what you and I do and Chris does and John and everybody. We see what Ant is flawed at, and the national media doesn't want to go there. They do not want to go to, Ant remains like the greatest defender in the world. Well, if, for 6% of the possessions. So, if you're going to honestly cover a team, up and applauding the best things about it without commenting on some of the ways there are flaws in that game. And the fact that Finch didn't leave me hanging out to dry on those opinions and instead engaged them in a meaningful way, I thought was really good for people to read, and also really, really good to know that that relationship remains so solid that kind of conversation can happen between Finch and me.
Yeah, I think it was how it went in the conversations. You talked about the mid-range stuff first, and Finch acknowledged some shortcomings there, some decision making and that sort of stuff. He gave you a fair response to that. So then when off-ball defense came up a paragraph later, it warranted him being able to say, I honestly feel like it's improving to the off-ball defense, right? And so do I. It absolutely is improving, and particularly if we go back to like year one, Ant, of what that was me. But even just like the playoffs last year, and the end of the season, that last quarter of the chunk of the year where Ant really had to step up with Carl out, like Finch kind of corrected this idea, but it looked like the care factor went up. Finch said like the care factor was never a problem. But I think there was way more intention from Ant, or the intention defensively to think through defense really grew over the course of last season and has been growing over the course of his career. I mean, there's still like the crazy he's asleep and he gets backdoored stuff that, really pops out and we go, oh my gosh, Ant. But I do think, if we're being fair, as Finch is, and I'm trying to be, I do think the off-ball defense has taken a step forward after looking like a serious issue, earlier in his career.
I thought the most important comments in that whole discussion were, what is at the root of this? He said, because it isn't just off-ball defense on defense. It's off-ball offense. He doesn't cut. He doesn't play off the ball nearly as much. He is less engaged when he is off the ball on offense, as well as less engaged when he's off the ball on defense. Right. And Finch said, well, the root of that is very simple. All his life, he's been on the ball one way or another. He's either guarding somebody on the ball or he has the ball. And so, and sometimes we think about Ant, the whole, he's only 21, he's only 22, now he's only 24. There will come a time when that will get old, but it still is somewhat relevant that the guy is still like 24 years old, and he has some things about him and the way he plays basketball. If he's guarding the guy with the ball, he's not as locked in. Okay, that's just a fact. Everybody can see that. Yes. On offense, you can see it too. Ant doesn't make the backdoor cut very often. Ant doesn't do a lot of the things, all the little things that like Mike Conley does or Nas does or some of these other people, and so
because he doesn't have experience doing that, or didn't at a young age.
And because he is a player who is so locked in when he's locked in. I mean, Finch just frankly said, when I was talking about, they've gotten it, opponents have gotten to notice that the bobble aspect of him on off-ball defense, they'll, out of a timeout, they'll create a false distraction for Ant.
Get him backdoor,
and get him back door. So, and then he said, and it may be a time when he needs to rest. And that, I love that comment because that's the NBA reality, folks. Every now and then you've got to, anybody who plays playground or gym basketball knows this. Right. There's a time when when you're saying, hey, all right, I'm the play is away from me right now. I'm going to catch a couple of quick breaths so I'm ready for the next possession we have. And it's not that much different because the caliber of play relative to everybody else is kindred. You're playing people who you're challenged by, regardless. You may be a fantastic player, but you're playing against fantastic players and they wear you out.
To the mid-range point, or the shot selection point, it isn't all mid-range. Like, actually, Finch did a good job of distinguishing about
it's frequency. I don't like his shot selection at all. But go ahead.
Yeah, but what I do think is interesting is Finch has never been full on like remove that from your game.
He's tried, but he's tried with tongue in cheek,
not stringently.
No, he won't yank him or anything, right?
Right. Well, or even like I think part of it was Finch did see that becoming a weapon for Ant down the line. We, again, you're covering the team every single day and you're looking at, his first 2 years in the league, I'm pretty sure he shot a lower percentage from mid-range than he did from 3-point range. And it's just like, when you're looking at it on paper there, you're like, what are we doing here?
Like even last year, like of the people who had the volume Ant had, I think he was like, if there was like 35 people who had his volume, he was like 34th in accuracy.
Yeah. So even it's still there. It is getting better, but it's still, at that level. It does make sense for that to be something that is in Ant's bag to use,
he has proven
playoffs. Yeah, for sure. Like late in games, all that sort of stuff. But what he said was he compared it, or maybe you did, compared it to Durant's.
No, I mentioned Durant for, the twos and the threes.
Yeah, explain that.
And he made a really important distinction, which was Durant doesn't require all the gymnastics to get open. He keeps it simple. Gets to the mid-range and shoots it. But he said that's because he's so much taller, Right. And so what he wants Ant to do is simplify his game. And if that simplification doesn't give you an open mid-range, don't necessarily go on gyrations. But if you have a clean, he said, I've invented a new term. He said, this is what Finch said to me. Yeah. I've invented a new term, the clean mid-range. And I tell him, if you have a clean mid-range,
sure.
And he even said, in crunch time, a clean mid-range is much preferable to a hero 3. If we're down by a point, don't jack up a hero 3. And Ant is fond of coming down, with a pull-up 3, and sometimes that's a great shot too. But if he can get that clean mid-range, I agree with Finch there. If it's crunch time, we have seen one of the ways that analytics has proven to be kind of, wonky to the point of not really watching what really happens in basketball. There are definitely times when a defense in crunch time will give you the mid-range. And if you take it and make it, it's a good play.
I think with Ant, regardless of what coverage they're in, weirdly, it's going to give him the mid-range in a late time clutch situation, right? Like, of course, if the Wolves are, spread it out and just set a Rudy Ant pick and roll, they might just bring the big back and, Ant can come in for a clean mid-range shot there too. But I think what more commonly happens for guys once they, they're the lead ball handler, when they get elite levels and late in games, is you blitz that, right? And defensively, and then if the guy with the ball in his hands, the Luka, the Harden, the Ant, want to keep the shot for themselves, well, then you need to split that coverage, right? The double basically coming up in the pick and roll. And now if you have effectively split it, you are now 4-on-3, probably going down, and they're going to stay home on Rudy in that situation often, right? Because if it's
they are going to make sure shoot that mid range because I don't want you driving. I don't want you blowing past me.
Mm-hmm.
Ant blowing past me. I mean, that's
That's
not
they don't want to give that up either. So they're building a wall to take away Rudy. So whenever I start thinking more about this mid-range stuff, there's going to be situationally, if they're in a drop and it's a situation where you want Ant taking the shot, sure, step in and take a clean mid-range shot there too. But I think the big one and the game changer for Ant, because he doesn't have that size that Durant has, what he needs to be able to do in that area is get the floater game going. And that is something that is just not an Ant's game. And particularly if we picture that like 4-on-3 situation, you still want to pick at Ant. That's going to be, that's going to be the shot that's there. And now if you start like spooking them that you have that, okay, now you have the drop off to Cat. Now you have the lob to Rudy right there. Those sort of things. So he does need to.
Does he have the temperament for that? It feels to me like guys who have good floaters have finesse games. You know what I mean? The way I see Ant, even Ant's finesses are.
I'm talking like 7 foot. Like get as deep as you can.
I get it. But that floater is going to not be one of those things where the momentum of the drive helps the ball go off his hand. Ant is one of those guys, he will keep that ball in his hand and then flick it if it's 7 feet. He's not the kind of guy who's going to give you your classic floater. You know, I mean, one of the things that I notice is that the shot that I am applauding on the mid-range now, because it's gorgeous, and then two, it goes in a lot more than it should. That dipsy doodle over the left shoulder in the right block, that 16-foot banker.
Yeah.
Oh my God. You know, I mean, that is pretty accurate. I don't know how accurate it is. But to Finch's greater point, Finch doesn't like the fact that he comes out shooting mid-ranges when he doesn't have to. And that often leads, he says, I haven't got the stats, but Finch certainly does. That leads to some of his worst games.
Yeah, that was interesting.
When he comes out and shoots mid-ranges when there's actually really no reason for it. And he says that Ant does it to kind of, quote unquote, get himself going. When the fact of the matter is it doesn't get him going at all. It's the opposite. That's what they're trying to drum out of his head.
Read the Ant part. Like if you feel like, okay, I can't read all 4 parts, Britt, read this one. The Ant one, like, is so interesting because it's the coach talking about this evolution of a player and kind of not necessarily fighting, but kind of fighting Ant's own internal thought process so as to like guide him into something better. Finch always kept turning it into like, well, what are the things that he does special? The mid-range isn't one of those. Not that we're taking that away, but can we lean more into things he does special? He's special at the rim in that situation, in those situations. He's also a special catch and shoot 3-point shooter. And Finch said to you, like, you know, that still isn't natural to him. Like he's great.
That's the thing he takes away when he doesn't feel good about himself.
Yeah,
He's shooting, catching threes.
What he gets most reluctant with when slumping, when it's what he should trust most. Yes, the catch and shoot 3, but then also Ant's the real special thing, and this is what's developed, I don't know, over the last 18 months, is the dribble 3s,
right?
And the ability to hit those, to be able to hit 3s at a high clip off the bounce. Now, there's even a distinction between those. I think the hero 3s Finch is talking about is like, all right, we're in the half court setting, nothing really developed, like double side step back. That's a dribble 3. Ant can make that, and sometimes when he's in one of those crazy like third quarters, he's hitting those. I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's talking about you're in semi-transition, you're going downhill, the defender is basically playing back to the elbow right there just because they're like, shit, it's Anthony Edwards. And it's that slow dribble in straight on 3-point shot.
Absolutely.
That is the real weapon. And Ant knows that too.
That first one you talked about, the defense is going to be popping champagne corks if they get Ant to shoot a fadeaway 3 with a double team on him. You know, I mean, that's great defense.
And Ant's turning back to Finch doing this with his hands. It's like there was only 5 seconds on the shot clock, you know, like.
And why is that? You
We know.
And a lot of times that's because you've tried to go through 3 guys for 5 seconds yourself.
Exactly.
Get off it, get it back, whatever. And then the other thing that Finch said about this, just to kind of complete the thing, is simplify. do what you can do. You were getting to it a little bit where you say, you do what you do well. And he mentioned two things about that. One is like apparently either he couldn't remember whether it was Myles Garrett or Aaron Donald. As they've got three moves. They've got a power move. They got like an up move or a spin move or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Kevin McHale said the same thing. I go to the center of the court. When that's taken away, I go baseline. When that's taken away, I have an up and under. That's all I need. And Finch was saying, simplify it. And he said it's beyond Dan. And so it is one of the few get off my lawn kind of kids these days comment. But he said, nowadays with all this player development stuff, they want to flower it up. They want to. They don't want to do the simple things that and that's true to some extent with Ant. And this is one area where I think Ant has gotten a lot better. His finishing is less flowery than it used to be and a lot more effective. He doesn't go for the ridiculous spin move. And he did listen to Finch a lot, and to his great credit, both for the team and for his own coachability, he draws fouls now on the drive, whereas before he was really trying to avoid it his first couple of years, 3 years. He was,
that seems like the obvious one. That's like, it's a matter of time until that becomes a weapon. But Finch is like, okay, like, let's go,
Exactly.
Let me grab one more break here and then we'll do a little bit more. Today's show is also brought to you by Adriana Lonick at Coldwell Banker Realty. And there's going to be a handful of you listening. I know obviously this isn't everyone out there, but there's a lot of you who listen, and some of you are going to be buying or selling a home sometime, this fall or winter. And maybe if you're a first-time home buyer, especially, you're going to need help in that project, I guess, too. And you're going to need to find a realtor for that. And we'd love it if you considered Adriana Lonick at Coldwell Banker Realty. She's licensed in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. If you want to contact her, you can go to thedancingrealtor.com for more information, or you can call 715-304-9920 to book a strategy session. That information's in the show notes. But also for the season, if you do schedule a strategy session with Adriana, however many of you do schedule one of those, she's going to randomly pick out of that group and get some tickets to one of you to attend a Wolves game for free. So we're trying to Realty and Timberwolves come together. It's some of these things are things that you do need if you are going to be in the house buying process. So again, thedancingrealtor.com or 715-304-9920 to book a strategy session with Adriana. Britt, I know this is a little bit deeper cut, but I liked the Kyle Anderson and Joe Ingles segment of the of your conversation with Finch. One line I thought really encapsulated it from Finch was, I don't think we lose that much there at the Kyle Anderson spot. And without Joe, we would be losing a bunch, which is a way of saying, like Joe Ingles is going to fill in the role of Kyle Anderson. Okay, we kind of knew that. Some things they do differently. But what that says to me is Finch reminding people, or reminding you, that was a very important role on this team, whether it be on the floor, off the floor, maturity-wise, connective tissue-wise, it's pretty easy for us to estimate that Joe Ingles is going to have a lot of the same connective tissue pieces to Rudy, to Mike, that Kyle did to Rudy, to Mike, to being that vet in the locker room there. I am, like Kyle and I talked about it a little bit the other day, I think just overall the Ingles acquisition is getting a little slept on. And I know it's because he's old. And you look at the 37, but packaged correctly, I do think he can fill in a big part of that Kyle Anderson hole. And that was a real hole. And they didn't have hardly any other means to go about trying to kind of caulk that hole that they had in the foundation of losing Kyle Anderson. As time's gone on, I've been more excited about Joe Ingles, and I think there's plenty of reasons to be encouraged by that. And it's good to see that Finch kind of is too.
Yeah, the part I really enjoyed, because the thing that bothers me the most is I don't think Ingles is a very good defender anymore. And I think that Kyle Anderson surprised me with how versatile his defense was.
Sure.
I mean, he was the guy who could guard Zion, in my opinion, as well as anybody. He was the guy who could guard, a lot of players that you wouldn't immediately say, oh, that's Kyle Anderson's guy, But what he said, he had said he doesn't have as much defensive versatility. And I immediately said, and he doesn't play defense as well, which it irked him a little bit because he just got through saying, yeah, he doesn't have that. I mean, why are you again bringing it up? And part of it was because it's a sore point for me. But his comeback on that was really helpful for me, which was he doesn't have the defensive talent that Kyle Anderson has, but the intangibles, knowing the game plan, adapting to the game plan, being able to have fidelity to the game plan so people know where everybody should be going, and being able to vocally point out where people should be in the game plan and how the game plan needs to flex because it's falling apart. It's like the old Gorgie Jank thing, X's and O's you don't have X's and O's on the court. Ingles is one of those guys that can take the ambiguity of X's and O's on the court and make them relate to the game plan that was talked about. And I think that is a really valuable skill. It's what Draymond Green probably is the best example in the NBA. Rudy is also a great example of that in the NBA. But being able to communicate, remind people of defensive principles while those things are being flexed, I think is an underrated skill that I hadn't thought much about. That is one of the ways that slow-mo was really invaluable. And that can be a way. I think Joe Ingles can do that as well as slow-mo did, because he doesn't. One of the reasons is because he doesn't have the ability, and he's not stupid. He knows that he's got to compensate for that in some way. And one of the ways he compensates for his defensive lack of athleticism on defense is being smart and figuring out that. And I think that's I thought that was a really good defense of Joe Ingles, to my point that I'm worried about this guy's defense.
I do think they will miss him defensively, right? In the ways that are highlighting. One, I just spent some time thinking about this. Kyle was, I think, most important defensively, or just as an overall connective tissue, in the Rudy Nas lineups. Just even looking at some of the totals, that was a lot of Kyle's minutes, and some of the better ones and he's at the 3 there, right? Which I think takes us to our negative side of this, which goes, well, Kyle Anderson, for all the great things that Finch listed and all that, had a real discernible and cratering downside of his offense at the 3 and the lack of spacing that it created, particularly when out there with Rudy. They handled that well in the Nas minutes. Yes. And I think we could go into why that is. But when Nas wasn't out there with that pairing with Rudy, but Kyle was, it got messy. And
they didn't have any spacing, right?
They didn't have any spacing. And surprisingly, we complained about Kyle at the 3 all year last season. His numbers were actually better at the 3 in the aggregate than there were at the 4. I forgot about that, reminded myself of that. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't extremely problematic sometimes when Kyle was at the 3. And the ways that it was extremely problematic, you plug Joe Ingles into that, he solves. Simply from a spacing standpoint, he can provide you the level of, in a pinch point guarding or secondary ball handling that Kyle Anderson was actually really good at. Joe Ingles can do that same stuff too. People like to point to Joe Ingles' turnover totals last season in Orlando, which were bad, but it's because I think he got pushed too much into point guarding.
Slow-mo did not have a good turnover rate.
Exactly. And so that's if we're balancing those two out, I just think we would, I think objectivity tells us that Kyle Anderson, despite some flaws, was a really productive piece on the Wolves last season. The areas in which he did have flaws, Joe Ingles answers some more of those. And some of the other areas of like, Kyle at the 4 that were advantageous. Situationally, that was advantageous. Joe Ingles isn't going to be able to solve that. And they're going to have to piece that together.
Right.
Other ways that some of the Cat, Rudy, Nas, all together sort of stuff, tweaking with the rotation. But the most irksome thing about Kyle Anderson last season is solved. Will not happen with Joe Ingles, because Joe Ingles is a 40% 3-point shooter. It's
right.
And that matters.
And what did Kyle Anderson sign for from Golden State? What did Joe Ingles sign for from Minnesota? I mean, you have to, we talk about the second apron. You don't want to stay there. One of the ways that you're really trying to work hard to save pennies is on these margins, 7th, 8th, 9th men that you want to play and have to play. That's what Denver had to go through. They had to figure out their 8th and 9th men last year when they lost a lot of their bench. And this is a fix that is not a perfect fix, but gets you some of what you had in what Slow-Mo was good at, and actually gives you something that Slow-Mo couldn't do.
Right.
That was very important. By the way, he could do it the year before. He was hitting that 3, and he was going to the corner or going to the slot. And when he was wide open, he let it fly and was making 40%. Well, that's the Joe Ingles template. Joe Ingles knows how to get to the corner, get to the slot, and he knows that if he's wide open, he'll take it right away, and Rudy will be under the basket, and maybe Nas will be there too.
Sure.
And if they're running out on him, he's smart enough to pass the ball to the people who need it. Probably Rudy, who he has a great chemistry with for years. Sure. I mean, I think there was a year, and I could be wrong about this. It's one of those things that goes into the ether. I used to know it. But I think Utah may have had the best offense in the NBA when Joe Ingles and Rudy Gobert were like starters on that team.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a really good offense. I don't know if it was the best, but it was a really good offense. And Joe Ingles had great chemistry. Now, there's a lot of mileage on both of them, quite frankly, but certainly Ingles more than anybody because of that horrific injury that we actually saw live happened at Target Center. But Joe Ingles can work with Rudy in a way that Rudy is going to love and Rudy is going to embrace. And as a result, Rudy, like he did in Utah, is going to cover up a lot of bad Joe Ingles defense sometimes.
For sure. Yeah, it may be irrelevant, but if you go back and watch some like Joe Ingles in the bubble on that Jazz team.
Exactly.
And so did Mike. I mean, Mike Conley was like 30 a night. Like I went and watched like 2 games from that.
Well, that series where it was Donovan Mitchell and Jamal Murray, like in a big shootout.
Yes.
That was also a cool time for some of the guys that are now Timberwolves.
It was like I just was like looking up some of the box scores. I'm like, yeah, we all just focused on Murray and Mitchell, but that series was nuts. Also, Jokic was nuts in that, and Rudy really struggled guarding him. And why they ultimately kind of lost that. But that's a series.
That's why we let Karl Anthony Towns.
Exactly. That's they learned something from that. Last thing on Anderson, I do think he's just basketball wise a better fit for the Golden State Warriors than he is for the Timberwolves. Which isn't to say that he was a bad fit on this, but he's a good fit there. I've been saying for a long time, I think Kyle Anderson is a center. I think that's a way I would, a bench center if you want to play him in starting groups. He probably does need to play the 4 and need to accommodate that with shooting and whatever. But I think Kyle Anderson being on a team that he needs to slide up from the 4 to the 5 makes more sense than being on a team that he often needs to slide from the 4 to the 3. Last thing I want to get. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, people won't get this comparison easily, perhaps. But there is a lot of Draymond Green in Kyle Anderson.
I know.
He is a communicator. Exactly. He is a communicator. He's best when he's in the middle of the floor directing traffic, throwing the ball, and then turning around and hitting that little mid-range every now and then. But he's a communicator. He's not as much of an asshole as Draymond is, but he's feisty. He's salty, as is Joe Ingles. But he is going to be, I know that your perfect comp, and I admire it, is that, he's the backup for Jokic, but he is also a very good backup for Draymond Green.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they don't lose that cool offense, that multiple millions of cuts. It's almost like the heliocentric thing that Finch kind of doesn't like, but everybody's kind of swirling around. But Draymond oftentimes when the Warriors were rolling, Draymond was top one or top two on the team in assists. And
because they play that split action stuff, and Draymond was a good passer. Kyle will be able to be the guy holding the ball in a split action and being able to find that read of the shooter coming out, or
and if that doesn't work, there are cuts, there are baseline cuts, there are weak side threes. I mean, slow-mo, it's perfect for slow-mo, actually.
And good for him. I just think it's like that's the type of team that I'm not surprised that team was able to outbid the Wolves for Kyle Anderson's services. I think he's more valuable to that team than he is to this team. So thus
he's more valuable to that team than Klay Thompson. How's that for a big statement? It is. I'll tell you, he is. Klay Thompson was overrated last year, and he is incredibly overrated on reputation. He's a phenomenal player who has fallen off in the last few years, and that's just a fact.
Speaking of Klay Thompson, let's wrap up with Jaden McDaniels.
All right.
That was what remember little Klay?
That's right. The jersey tussle.
The jersey tussle into the Draymond headlock. But really,
it's so cold, right?
That was a segue. There we go. I just thought, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the first one, just like kind of this idea of Finch, expecting an improvement from Jaden, but I hadn't read this part yet, or we didn't talk about it specifically. He talks about with Jaden, quote, "I am building in Jaden McDaniels taking a step forward, defensively, learning personnel tendencies, eliminating fouling, and he can be a better rebounder." And then offensively, he talked about consistency and, rightly highlighted how good Jaden was, not only in the playoffs, but kind of that last month of the season.
Right.
But also noted that Jaden was really inconsistent the first 2/3 of the season last year. Finch talks about, which, was a good reminder of, he wasn't really around last summer because he was in his contract negotiation, was kind of holding out for that extension that didn't come until right before the season actually started, signed in training camp a year ago. But he didn't say a lot of players had great summers. He certainly didn't say anybody had an incredible summer like he did. I think actually Josh Minot, he said, had a good summer, but incredible summer.
Josh Minot, but the difference there is Josh Minot's vying to be a 10th man, and Jaden McDaniels is vying to be a third option. I mean, that is really,
and it sounds like Finch believes it, the steps he took are believable, that he could move in that direction.
Jaden is always, in his own quiet way, wanted to say, "Hey, just get me the ball, and I'll show you I can be a baller on offense as well."
Right.
And there are times when that is definitely so. If we remember how he came into the league as a springy, surprisingly good defender, and also a remarkably good catch and shoot 3-point corner shooter. Almost 80% of his shots, I think, were corner threes.
Sure.
He was a specialist. And so he kind of got pigeonholed as this defensive specialist. And I think Finch, we had that conversation, the Finch.
And of course he did, because his surrounding pieces, as he kind of began coming of age, were Karl Anthony Towns still figuring it out defensively, Anthony Edwards for sure still figuring it out defensively, and D'Angelo Russell, not a strong defensive player. Jaden almost was like, yes, you have to put
the 10-pole defense.
You have to put your effort in on the defensive side of the floor. Do what Pat Bev is doing. We got plenty of the other stuff over here. But now Jaden was 21 then, or whatever. He's 24 now, and it is time to show a little bit more, or would be advantageous to be able to drill for something more in there. And it sounds like Finch is really, it's built into their plan of how they're going to use this team this season. So I think that's
this is the Tim Connelly method. Tim Connelly, if he signs you to a fat contract that isn't a max contract, but he signs you to something where you're not just a role player, you're a super role player, and you're getting paid like a super role player. He's getting $25 million a year. You know, that's not peanuts. So yes, he's a great defender, but you know, he can be something else, and everybody sees it. You know, every now and then, if you put a weak defender on Jaden, he will torch that guy. He will torch him. He will get 8 points in a quarter. Not that
they try to put a little Trae Young on him, like Atlanta always tries to do that.
Like, I mean, and so, and he got into this in the first part, talking about using more pick and roll with Rudy, more pin downs where he comes around. The idea of him getting to the rim, but then what he said, and like when we revisited Jaden, he needs to be able to play make more because he didn't have very many opportunities. He was hunting points. And I noted that he didn't do a lot of drive and kick. I think Jaden would be ideal for drive and kick to a Joe Ingles, for example, or Mike Conley. You know, I mean, there are going to be opportunities where once Jaden becomes a threat at the rim on big pick and rolls with Rudy, and it is, Jaden is 6'10", going on 6'11". It is a classic 4-5 pick and roll, only he happens to play the three. And you've got outside shooters there. I mean, that's NBA 101 nowadays. You know, you roll your bigs and you hit your outside marksman, and that could really work.
Very Finch line when you brought up, like, you know, needing more playmaking, and Finch said, quote, he gets very few scoring opportunities, so he is very blinkered on scoring. I was like, blinkered. Okay. Yeah. I guess that doesn't work. But it makes sense, right? Like, it's a opportunity. Here's a, like, there's no help here. I'm just going to one dribble move, and here I am to the middle of the floor. Like,
worst case scenario, do the rocking chair. You know?
Right. Which wasn't
bad, but yeah.
So yeah, it will be interesting to see what more playmaking comes with. It'll be interesting to see, do defenses start accounting for him more? Because he got very little attention. And he's like, even at the like small part of the pie that he already owns, if I'm coaching against that, I'm like, let's not let this guy get off either. You know, Finch always says that Jaden McDaniels is a barometer for the offense. If I'm a scout, like, I'm listening to that, you know, and accommodating more accordingly. And yeah, like, to give Jaden McDaniels a little bit more defensive attention, you're inherently decreasing a little bit of focus on Ant or Cat or whatever. But I do think, because Jaden is almost always guarded by the worst defender on the other team, is quote unquote hidden on McDaniels. I think the point is we should be able to get to a point of punishing that. And I'm not sure that, and I think at some point this season, teams will learn they can't do that. And you're not going to come out and do, or remember even like Boston in the beginning of the season, they did the Porzingis on him thing.
Right.
They put Drew Holiday on Cat, and they just had Porzingis just kind of chill in the lane, Rudy on Jokic style. Like, again, come playoff time too, that's going to be an important thing that you need to not be able to do against Jaden. And I think things are progressing in that direction, but you probably need to like water that plant a little bit during the season. It sounds like,
and I think what will bloom there, if you look at the Timberwolves and you look at that starting five and you say this team is 17th in offensive efficiency, you go, whoa, you know, I mean, with Naz Reid and the sixth man of the year off the bench, that's starting five of Conley, Ant, Jaden, Rudy, and Cat. And then you have Naz coming off the bench. I mean, come on. And that's 17th. So I think the obvious answer to that is, aside from Mike Conley, there was a lot of terrible decision-making among those other four players. And what you need to do is you need to improve the decision-making. And how do you do that? Well, you give people more responsibility so they can't say, well, you know, I don't ever get the ball, so I was going to try to score on this play. You know, what you did with Rudy the discipline you installed in Rudy. You need to install that discipline in Cat. You need to install that discipline in Ant. And that Finch, that was kind of a running theme, very low level theme, but Cat can't always look for Rudy when he's got the ball and they have a 2-man game down there. Other people are going to become available. Jaden, if he's going to get the ball more, needs to make better decisions. Ant needs to start playmaking, being better as a playmaker, a decision maker. All of these things, just make smart decisions. When the Wolves were terrible on offense, so many times it was Cat and Ant taking the air out of the ball and surveying the court. Yep. And you've got so many weapons if you just fucking move, you know? And so, you know,
you're right.
And so that has to happen. Jaden McDaniels is a great way to help that happen because you get him moving. And that was another part, you know, Finch and I were talking. I mentioned this and Finch agreed with it. He's a better player when he's moving. When Jaden is just standing there, aside from that rookie year when he was making a lot of catch and shoot threes, he has not been good when he's just standing still. And so I think having him on the go more, involving him in more action, involving everybody in more action, and not having to rely so much on Mike Conley being the only adult in the room in a half-court defense, a half-court offense, that has to happen.
Yeah, and also just given the age, it makes sense to see like what more do we have here? Because I think they know that they feel like they have something in an open gym setting, a lot more from Jaden, and they're just, whether it be lack of opportunity or just flashes here and there, they haven't seen that more in the real games, except, you know, I mean, the playoffs, they kind of did, or maybe the playoffs were the first time they really did. So it's like, all right, let's lean into this a little bit more. Let's see how far we can take it, because that's going to help this team now. And that is critical for 2-3 years down the road, is that Jaden has to be this. These things that they're developing need to click. And yeah, need to be a part of it. So it's going to be cool to see more Jaden this year. I don't have anything else. I think we milked this 4-part Finch and Britt interview.
Whatever it is. I mean, that was just a pretext.
Yes.
We could, sit down. We can do an hour.
Easy. Well, we're gonna have a lot more just of these sort of quotes and thoughts and things that are gonna come.
We're gonna start to get evidence soon.
I know.
Monday, it's Friday right now. On Monday, there's media day. On Tuesday, there is training camp starting, and you've got, we'll get a Mike Honori practice press conference, which is always great. We'll get one of those where he'll basically let like 4 secrets out of the bag. So,
That's true. And then a week from today, right? A week from today, is it the 4th is the first game. So yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
It's coming. We may have dried this Finch Britt well, but there's gonna be plenty more stuff to get to soon. Thank you for doing 2 of these episodes.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
This week, Britt. You guys can go see Britt on Saturday at MinnFest. Again, go to MinnPost.com for more details on that. Here, Britt and Ethan Cass in chat, and go say what's up to Britt. I'm going to be out of town, unfortunately, but yeah, check Britt out there. And then Monday we got media day. Me and Kyle are going to do an immediate reaction pod from the facility there, and then we kind of start our process of almost daily episodes. We'll get Chris and Jace back in the mix, and I think Britt and I will go again next Thursday, right before kind of recapping what the week was. So yeah, until Monday with Kyle, he's Britt. Follow my Twitter at Britt Robson. Read him at MinnPost. I'm Dane. Peace out.
How I'm feeling, man, I hope it never stop, yeah. Green and hot so you can find me in the crowd, yeah. Don't let standards ever bring you down, yeah.